Wonderful, wonderful. I love registered nurses who pursue things that are so incredibly different. And so we have Kim Leffler with us here today, registered nurse. I knew her from the Red Cross. And Nancy, you knew Kim from there as well, right? So Kim has written a book because of the experience that she had with her father, who had dementia, and she also went through a hospice process with her dad. So Kim has graciously come today to share with us. We have her book on the back table as well. And Kim, we welcome you. Come on up.
Oh. Thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. I have fantastic memories of the way that Companion Extraordinaire helped with my father and with my mother, who was his primary caregiver for a very long time until I took over. I do have to correct Dawn on one thing. I would love to claim that I'm a registered nurse, but I'm not. I am just an interested layperson who has written a couple of books on healthcare, which has given me a lot of inside knowledge. I have a great many family members and friends who are constantly sending me medical questions. I have to reply with, I'm not a doctor, but this is what I know. And it's been wonderful for me to be able to research and learn and share and give people the benefit of what I happen to find out. Now, one of the great things for what I've done is that although I wasn't a registered nurse, and perhaps this helped that I wasn't, but my father, when he developed Alzheimer's, it was when he was about 75, and he lived to be 86 when he passed away from Alzheimer's. And at the time that he was diagnosed, which would be 20 years ago now, he died 10 years ago, the life expectancy for someone with Alzheimer's was 5 or 6 years, and I was able to give him another 6 years of quality life, and more importantly, help my mother out. My mother was killing herself trying to take care of my dad, and it took her a long time to acknowledge that my father had Alzheimer's. When Dad was initially beginning to show symptoms, he had an IQ that literally was off the charts. He was that intelligent. Member of Mensa, PhD, wonderful, talented, intelligent, excellent man. And for my mother to acknowledge that he had something wrong with his brain was for her something that she couldn't do. She could not bring herself to admit that there was anything wrong with his brain, even though we know that this is not a mental illness. For my mother, she couldn't get there. She refused to acknowledge it, and for a long time she wasn't giving him the help that he needed. Instinctively, she was encouraging him to do the right things, like taking walks and drinking coffee and, staying active. But it wasn't because she thought it would help Alzheimer's, because she didn't acknowledge that he had dementia. And dementia is, it's demented, right? I mean, mental and demented and so forth, that has a stigma attached to it. So it took a while for us to get her to agree to get my dad evaluated. And I won't say that we lost time in that process, but it certainly didn't help. Where I was able to help, and one of the key things that I was able to do for my mother was that I lived 600 miles away. My 3 brothers lived within 20 minutes of my parents, so they were able to come over for Sunday dinner, come over in the afternoon and spend some time. And my dad was able to hold it together. My mother was able to hold it together. They had no idea what was going on when they weren't there. But I started going up. Every 3 months, I would go up and stay a week with my folks. So I was there 24/7. And I began to pick up on the on the nighttime issues, the sundowning, and the difficulty getting up in the morning, and the anger when that began appearing. These were things that my mother wasn't telling anybody about. She certainly wasn't sharing it with my brothers. My sisters-in-law would have helped in a heartbeat, but they didn't know either. But she couldn't hide it from me when I was up there. I was the only daughter. I was the eldest, so I had, responsibilities that come with all of that. And I'm the kind of person who solves problems. Everywhere I've ever worked, I've become the person people go to, how do we fix this? What do we do about that? How can we make that better? I just, built that way. It's easier if I just acknowledge and deal with the problem than try to avoid it. So this was my dad. I loved my dad. I loved my mom. I saw what this was doing to them, and I was just determined to find some common sense, practical things that would help. We got my dad on Aricept. That helped immediately. The problem was my mother didn't realize, and nobody told her this was not her fault. She just was never given this information, that giving my dad the Aricept exactly 24 hours. It wasn't, 11:10 and the next day 11:30. It was 11 o'clock and 11 o'clock and 11 o'clock. And every minute that you missed being on the Aricept was a decline that you didn't get back. My mom had no idea about that. She thought, well, he gets it in the morning, so any time in the morning is important. It wasn't good enough. So how could I make sure that my mother kept on that schedule? Because she was becoming a little forgetful herself. So I researched. I found out that there are pill boxes you can get with built-in timers, and they cover 3 times a day. So if you have medication you have to take 3 times a day, you can set the pill timer box for precise intervals. Failing that, you can turn the timer on the stove, for 24 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is. But there are things you can do that make it a little bit easier to remember those critical things. So over the course of about 4 years, I was going up every 3 months and seeing these things that were posing problems for my mom and coming up with solutions. And then it became obvious that even with Namenda added to the daily dose, my dad needed more care than my mother was willing to give. And although we had encouraged her to get help, to get somebody like you to come in and give her a hand, and she's not unique, I'm sure you run into this all the time, she said, I married my husband for better or for worse, for sickness or in health. It's my job to take care of him. I can't relinquish that responsibility to anybody. Even somebody who was wonderful, who could come in and take some of that burden from her. That was her job. And we kept saying, yeah, but Mom, taking care of Dad means getting him the help that he needs. You're not going to set his broken leg for him. You're going to take him to the doctor. So if you need help with a caregiver, get a caregiver. Well, she wouldn't. She refused to do that. So my husband and I talked about it, and I discussed it with my brothers, and we said, we have got to get Mom and Dad here with me. My brothers just were not in a position where they could help out. So we got them to move down to Virginia. They sold their house in Michigan and moved in. And one stipulation we had, as soon as we agreed that we were going to do this, I called Don. And I said, Don, we need caregivers. We need your people here. And I told my mother, this is the condition. If you come down here, we are getting help. Because I was working full time. I was at the Red Cross at that point. And I was not only working full time, I was traveling across the country to respond to disasters. And, I couldn't be there 24 hours a day to help out. My husband had a business that he was running from home. So he couldn't be available at all times to help out. And my mother said, okay. And Don came through with some of the best people we've ever been privileged to work with. And I don't know that they're all still with you, but they were wonderful. And I have nothing but good things to say about what you all did. What really helped was the fact that we had a male caregiver. And I know that those aren't easy to come by. And God bless, the men who step up and do that job. Because he was the only one who could get my dad to take a shower. And, most men, I don't care how far gone they are, they have a sense of personal modesty. And they're just reluctant to have a strange woman dealing with these intimate situations. But this caregiver got undressed himself and got into the shower with my dad. Now, a lot of people with dementia, and you know this as well as I do, get to a point where hearing running water is terrifying. They're really scared of it. They don't, even though the rest of us say, oh, hot shower, can't wait, or hot bath, that's going to make my day so much better. A lot of people with dementia are terrified by that noise. They don't connect it with anything good anymore. It's just a loud noise that troubles them. So the fact that someone was willing to get into the shower with my father made all the difference in the world. Because once he got in, and that warm water was flooding over him, and getting the soap, and now he's smiling. Because this was a great sensory thing, but getting there was a hard thing, and a woman could never have done that. So the role that the men play in this caregiving is just phenomenal. But I found out a number of things that made a huge difference once my parents moved in with me, and we had them there full time. I noticed that whenever my dad was sundowning, and I have to back up and say my dad is Swedish, was Swedish, 100% Swedish. And if you know anything about the Swedes, they are particularly prone to SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Come this time of year, it begins to get dark. Swedes get depressed. I'm half Swedish, so I know this personally too. Swedes drink a lot of coffee also, and they don't drink decaf. It's full strength, 100%. Some of the best coffee comes from Sweden. If you've ever had Gevalia, it's phenomenal coffee. But Swedes have cafes where they can go in and sit down at a table with a light box. So they're getting ultraviolet light while they're drinking their coffee. They know how to deal with seasonal affective disorder. This is just a routine thing. We don't tend to think about that in this country. But I noticed that when my dad was sundowning, it didn't have to be at night. It could be first thing in the morning. On a winter's morning before the sun comes up, or it's raining, or the sky is cloudy and there's a storm coming in. The blinds would be closed, the room would be dark, my dad would wake up, and everything was gray and gloomy. Now, my mother was never bothered by this. She could walk in the dark. I mean, she could go through the whole day without turning a light on. It never bothered her. And she couldn't understand that the reason my dad was not wanting to get out of bed and was incredibly depressed was because it really did bother him. She didn't make that connection, but I did. I saw how he was behaving, and I thought, well, what would I do if I were depressed? I'd turn on a light. I'd make a cup of coffee. I'd run the shower. I'd turn on some cheerful music. I'd open the blinds. I'd do all kinds of things that would perk my mood up. And so I began doing those things for my dad. And by golly, it didn't matter what time of day or whatever else was going on. As soon as my dad smelled the coffee, as soon as we opened the windows, as soon as I got Glenn Miller on the music channel, my dad was happy. I mean, he literally changed. It was wonderful. My dad was born in 1924. So he was a young man when Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller and the others were, he was a great dancer. Literally, right up to the day he died, people would step to the back of the room to watch him dance. I mean, he was so good. And he would remember all the lyrics, all the songs. And this is nothing new, you all know this. Whatever you remember from your childhood, it sticks with you. I don't care if you don't remember what day it is, or the name of your favorite grandchild. you were going to remember the words to the songs that were popular when you were 17 years old. That was when you were young, when you were strong, when you were happy, when life was ahead of you and everything was great. And if you listen to that music now, when life's not so good, it takes you right back there. So we had the music channel on to the 40s channel, 24 hours a day. It made all the difference in the world. It was great. And my dad never stopped loving coffee. If I wanted to see a smile, all I had to do was say, "Hey, Dad, how about a cup of coffee? Coffee, he'd say. Let's have some coffee." So it was just little things like that that I began to notice that made a difference. Now, later, as my dad's dementia progressed, even coffee wouldn't bring a smile to his face. He got angry. He got frightened. I mean, that's really what it is. My mother would approach him, and maybe he didn't know she was coming, and he would lash out. And my dad was a strong man. He wasn't big, but he had muscles, and he was protecting himself. When our cat was getting elderly and not quite there, she would lash out at whatever came to her. It was a protective measure. We understood this. My dad wasn't trying to hurt my mom. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know if she was a threat to him. So he would lash out, and she would go in to try to stop him, and then she'd get hit. Well, this was devastating to my mother, terrifying to the rest of us. And I thought, okay, now what can I do? How can I help with that? Well, I'm willing to try alternative medicine. I'm willing to try new things. Doesn't matter what it is. If it makes sense to me, I'll give it a shot. And I always research. I don't ever just take something at face value. I do my research. But I thought, how can I get my dad to do something that he won't do on his own? Well, how about hypnosis? Could I get my dad hypnotized so that he would respond to a command that would knock him out of his anger, put a smile on his face? So I called a few people locally. I found a fantastic psychologist who is a certified hypnotherapist named Dr. Robert Petrie down there off of Forest Hill. And he said, well, when I explained what it is I'm going to do, he said, nobody has ever asked me to do that before, but I'm willing to give it a try. Because, what can it hurt? A lot will depend on whether or not your dad is suggestible. Getting my dad to go was not the hard thing, because he was willing to go wherever we couldn't ask him if he wanted to do this. He wouldn't have known to be able to say yes or no. But my mother, still thinking about my dad's brain, was very worried that we were going to affect his brain negatively. So it took a couple of weeks to persuade my mother that it was going to be okay, that it would be worth giving a try. And we got down to see Dr. Petrie. And my husband was with me. My husband and I are sitting here. My mom and dad are right there. Dr. Petrie's right there. And he didn't swing a watch or anything like that. But he just began talking to my dad. And eventually he said, and we didn't know when my dad became hypnotized, except that the clue that we had was that my mother began crying. Just emotion. I mean, she wasn't upset about anything, she was just overwhelmed. And my father has always been my mother's champion. I mean, they were connected at the hip. He couldn't bear to see her cry, ever. But when he glanced over and saw that she was crying, and he didn't get upset by that. He didn't try to stop her. We knew that he was no longer the way he usually is. So clearly he was under hypnosis at that point. Well, Dr. Petrie said to my dad, "Tell me what happens, Jack, when you smile. Smile for me." And my dad smiled, and he said, "So what's going on?" your cheekbones are up. Your eyes are crinkling. Your mouth, the corners of your mouth are up. Your jaw is tightening a little bit, right? And he identified from my father and got my father to agree that this is what happens physically when you smile. So he tied the physical reaction to the word smile. And he made it so that if we said smile, my father's physical response, didn't matter what he wanted to do mentally or emotionally or anything, if we said smile physically, he had to tighten his cheekbones, raise his lips, crinkle his eyes. He had to smile. And it's amazing. You can't be angry and smile at the same time. It just, physically, they don't work. And we all practiced that. Every one of us practiced my dad getting a little upset and telling him to smile. And every single time, he stopped being angry. If he was swinging like this, he'd suddenly stop and he'd smile. And we could follow that up with, hey, Dad, how about some coffee? Yeah, I mean, that would be, that would really bring the smile. But it always, didn't matter which one of us did it. My brothers, strangers, companion extraordinaire, anybody who needed to get my dad instantly out of a bad mood just had to say, smile, and he would smile, and the mood would stop. It was phenomenal. And Dr. Petrie has used this. Now, he's bought so many copies of my book to give to patients of his who are using hypnosis to help with their patients. I mean, their family members who have dementia. It's really amazing. So that was one thing I did. Another thing I realized early on, my dad and I were walking up the road at our house, and I said, Dad, oh, isn't that honeysuckle amazing? Because the honeysuckle was in bloom everywhere, and the smell was overpowering. He said, what smell? What? Is there something? I said, you can't smell that? Well, as you probably know, the inability to smell certain things is one of the symptoms of dementia. In fact, there are 12 common scents, like bananas is one of them. And your inability to smell that is a signal that something may be going on. There's a big connection between the olfactory nerve and dementia. I didn't know that at the time, but as soon as I realized my dad couldn't smell, I looked it up and started doing some research into it. And I thought, okay, if this is a symptom of dementia, what can I do to reverse that? Is there any way that I can get my dad to start smelling things again? And I thought, let me test something. So I got a little Dixie cup, and I put a piece of cotton in the bottom, cotton ball, and I soaked it with eucalyptus essential oil, because that was one of the strongest things I could think of that I happened to have on hand, and I stuck it up under my dad's nose, and I said, Dad, take a big sniff. Well, he didn't smell anything right away, but after a couple of hours of working on this, he began to say, it smells like cold medicine. I thought, interesting. I also noted that his mental acuity was a little bit brighter when he'd been smelling this. So then I thought, okay, now how can I get him to smell? How can I keep this going? What do I need to do to help him smell things all day long? I couldn't. I really didn't want to attach it to an elastic cord and have it like a feed bag under his nose. But I thought, my dad is a man who used to wear aftershave. And aftershave is a masculine thing to do. And my dad loved to sit with his electric razor and shave. It was a very soothing thing for him. And when he got done, he would slap on the aftershave. And I thought, well, slapping on aftershave is putting a strong scent right under his nose. And it's something he's used to doing. So I encouraged him to start doing that again. And every day he'd go through the routine. He would shave. And boy, we went through a lot of aftershave because I wanted it there all the time. And throughout the day, I would just add more aftershave so that he constantly had an odor. And that did two things. One, it perked him up. Secondly, it got him to smell food. which once you lose that sense of smell, you lose your sense of taste. You know that. You know, people can't smell a turkey dinner. Their salivary glands don't work. Their stomach doesn't start rumbling. They don't want to eat. It tastes like ashes. You know, it doesn't taste like anything. And they're certainly not getting the nutrition that they need. So anything that I could do to help my dad feel hungry was going to be a good thing. And we didn't want him to lose weight. But that brings up another thing that we did. When Dad first moved down with us, we would sit, the four of us, because my children had grown up and moved out, but we'd sit at the dining room table. My husband would sit there, I would sit here, my mom would sit here, my dad would sit there. Well, the more my dad got into dementia, the less involved he was in the conversation. He didn't contribute, he didn't participate. My mother did a lot of talking. So Ray and I were looking at my mom. We were not looking at my dad because he wasn't participating. And I thought, well, this is not good. And Dad is out of it already, and we are excluding him. So how's that going to make him feel? You know, this is terrible. So that was an easy fix. We just moved him over so that he was next to my mom. So whenever my husband and I were talking to my mom, we couldn't help but look at my dad, too. He was right there next to her. So even if he wasn't participating in the conversation, we were making eye contact. And we would remember to say things to him, to include him in the conversation, even if he didn't participate. We were still including him. And that's so important. You know, people with dementia begin to withdraw into themselves, and they begin to get isolated. People stop coming to see them because they can't participate. It's a terrible thing. So you want to do whatever you can to encourage them to be involved. But one thing that we also learned was that inadvertently, and my mother loved to watch the news at night. She was kind of tied to the house with my dad, and watching the news kept her involved with what was going on in the world. And my dad was usually right there with her. Well, my mother could see stories about famine and war and buildings collapsing. Not take it personally, not get worked up about it. But my father, who'd been through World War II, and when a bear showed up on our back porch one day, some years ago, thought we were being attacked, and he was back in his tank in Germany, and was trying to figure out how he could deal with the enemy. He could see these things on TV, and he thought they were real, and they were real, but he thought they were affecting him. He thought they were a threat to him. And he didn't articulate that he was upset about it, but you could see he was getting upset. So we had to work with my mother to stop watching the news. That when we were watching TV with my dad, it had to be happy. It had to be something, it had to be a Disney movie, and not Bambi. We didn't want Bambi's mother killed in the middle of the movie. It had to be something like, like State Farm or a State Fair rather, or Pollyanna, or something like that. Something cheerful. Again, something from the 30s or 40s. The Little Rascals. Things like that. Things that would be funny. Things that would not be threatening in any way. Things that would not result in nightmares later on. It was just really like having a 4-year-old. If you wouldn't expose a 4-year-old to it, because there were images that you couldn't explain to them, that would scare them, then keep that away from someone with dementia as well. Again, a lot of this was just common sense to me, but it was a case of seeing what was going on and trying to come up with a solution for it, some logical, common sense solution. And it got easier and easier to come up with these things. One of the hardest things, as I say, was getting my mom to acknowledge that she needed help. Having companion extraordinaire was there. That helped enormously. But she needed a respite. And I was very interested to hear the information about hospice providing respite. My mother desperately needed respite, and she literally refused to do it. I wanted to get her into a caregiver support group. She refused to participate because she didn't want to, I found out later, she didn't want to talk. At first, she didn't think she needed it, even though our family doctor, whose patient she became, diagnosed her with depression that needed serious help. She didn't think she did, and gave her a prescription. She threw it away. She didn't think she needed the help. And if she did go to a caregiver support group, she was afraid that she was going to embarrass my father by talking about his issues, and that nobody else would understand it. And they would think less of him and think less of her. But a good friend of mine from church ran an Alzheimer's caregiver support group, and I forced my mother to go to a meeting with me. That was eye-opening for her, because sitting around the table were 6 people just like her. There were a couple of husbands, there were several wives, all of whom had spouses with dementia. Every one of them recounted situations that had happened with their loved ones that were exactly like the thing my mother was going through. And it was sort of a case of misery loves company. I mean, it was devastating in one way for my mom to find out that there were other people going through the same thing, because nobody wants to know that this problem is rampant. But it was really encouraging for her to find out that she wasn't alone. Unfortunately, she thought, well, one meeting is all I need. You know, I know there's help out there, but I really don't think I need it. So I couldn't get her to go back. I wish I could have. That would really have helped. Let's see, what else? But at this point, does anybody have any questions before I go on? Have you run into situations like this in your own experience? Yes.
When this is the situation that happened to me. When my mother got sick, she went through, I've had multiple people in my family that got sick and died. But when my mother got sick, she had first gotten breast cancer, and she beat that. Then about a year or so, almost 2 years later, she got lung cancer. I found out it went in her lymph nodes, which went into her brain. And she had, because of all the pneumonias and stuff, she ended up not being able to take the treatments. And eventually they put her on hospice. And she was on hospice for a while, and she was basically not waking up. She was on oxygen. We found out from somebody came in and just told us, you know, and they were wonderful about taking care of her and helping us and giving us stuff. But they said, you know that oxygen is just keeping her alive. That, you know, it's just prolonging her suffering, you know. We found out within an hour or so of taking her off the oxygen, which she'd been put on by, she passed.
Oh.
And, you know, and it helped that they went through there, and, you know, even though it was difficult to say goodbye, you know, it was helping her to be able to go through that. And I've tried to, in my job, working with the families to, you know, I don't know if this is with you, but I've tried to feel like make their lives easier, you know, pass on, you know, stories and such as the music and stuff. When I was with my patient, you know, I would try and find things that he enjoyed and give it to him and find ways to let him enjoy it. Like he couldn't hear music well, so I found little speakers to try and help him to be able to hear, because he didn't much care for it. He had a thing about the hearing aids, you know. And if I think we can all work together and to try to make the families, you know, even though they're not there and stuff, you know, I found like using electronics to be able to connect them. And it made him happier later on in life to be able to connect with them and feel like you could see them, FaceTime them, things like that. if we can find ways to make it easier for our patients and make it happier, then when they get into the hospice situations, we remember these things and it's all connected, I think.
I agree. I agree. You're mentioning electronics reminds me of something that we did with my dad as well. Oftentimes, people in the early stages of dementia begin attaching special importance to the things in their life, their wallet, in my dad's case, his razor, keys, and so forth, and they hide them. They have this idea that somebody's going to try to steal them, and so they tuck them away in places they can't remember later, and then you have this frantic search for the wallet or the keys or the remote control or whatever it is that they've hidden. Well, I found that Sharper Image sold these little devices, little buttons that you can put on special things, and when you're trying to find them, you can just hit on like a remote control the number of the item that you're trying to find, and it will beep. So you can find the wallet in the freezer, and you can find a remote control hidden at the bottom of the wastebasket in the bathroom, where it's been put for safekeeping. Unfortunately, there are only 4 buttons, so you have to hope that, whatever's special to somebody doesn't amount to more than 4 of them, but it is really important. And another thing that I wanted to mention, I should have said this first off, is that dementia, obviously, is not necessarily Alzheimer's. It could be Lewy body syndrome. It could be vascular dementia. My mother had vascular dementia that was brought on by stroke. And Aricept and Namenda will do nothing for that. But a lot of people are diagnosed with dementia, and it's simply because they have an insufficiency of vitamin B12. The older we get, the less intrinsic factor you have in your stomach. And intrinsic factor is a substance that extracts the B12 from the food that you eat. B12 can't get into your system unless intrinsic factor has taken it out of the beef or the chicken or whatever it is that you eat. So if you don't have enough intrinsic factor, I don't care how much B12 food you're eating, it's not making it into your nervous system. So it's really important that a proper diagnosis of dementia is made by the doctor before somebody starts getting put on Aricept or Namenda, or it could be simply getting an injection of B12 once a month. Will make all the difference and restore the person to prime nervous system health. So these are things that somebody needs to ask about before anybody's treated for dementia. Make sure that it is dementia and what it's caused by, and if there's anything that can be done to arrest it immediately. When my dad had first come down with us, he had serious hearing issues. He was in a tank in World War II, and we're pretty sure all that concussion really didn't do his ears any good. And he wore hearing aids, which were the old-fashioned kind, the flesh-colored ones that you stuck in the ear, and then you could just stick your finger in and twist the little knob to adjust the level of hearing. Well, I took batteries, and every once in a while the batteries would have to be replaced. We lived in Beaver Dam at that time. We've since moved, but we lived in Beaver Dam. Our nearest hospital was Memorial Regional, which for us was 45 minutes away. And my parents were still seated at the kitchen table for dinner when my mom decided to change the batteries in my dad's hearing aid. My daughter called at that moment, so I had stepped away from the table, and I'm turning my back to the table, chatting with my daughter, when all of a sudden I hear my mother say, "Jack, don't swallow that!" And I turned around, and my dad had picked up the hearing aid and had swallowed the hearing aid. Now this is a big lump of plastic. And I don't know what he thought he was eating. There was still dessert on the table. All I know is that my dad had a hearing aid lodged in his throat. So I immediately called 911 and told them what happened. And they said, is there a battery in that hearing aid? And I said, yes. Because my mother had just changed the battery and had handed it back to my dad so he could put it in his ear, and instead he'd swallowed it. And she said, then I'm not sending an ambulance. How far are you from the hospital? I said, 45 minutes. She said, I'll call the hospital ahead and tell them that you're coming, and they will get him into x-ray. And I said, why? I mean, my dad was still breathing. I was keeping an eye on that, ready to rush in and do CPR and the Heimlich if I needed to. But she said, if his throat acid eats through that plastic to that battery, that's a lithium battery, it will kill him. You've got to get him to the hospital. They can't help in the ambulance. You're going to have to get him to the hospital. So I load my dad and my mom in the car, in the back seat, and I am driving, trying not to get stopped. I've got one eye in the rearview mirror, checking to make sure my dad is still breathing, ready to pull over to the side of the road and do whatever I had to save his life. And I'm racing down 295 to Memorial Regional. We get to the ER. 6 hours later, they got him into x-ray. Even though I went up to the desk and I said, they called ahead, you're supposed to have x-ray on standby. And they looked at my dad and they said, he looks fine. I said, he's not fine. He swallowed a hearing aid. He has Alzheimer's. He needs an x-ray immediately. Well, we'll get to him. They took his vitals. His vitals were fine. They didn't see a problem. But my dad had Alzheimer's. By the time we got to the hospital, it was 8:30. It was almost his bedtime. He had a routine. He normally slept. He only went to bed about 9. He slept straight through the night, most of the night. He was in a strange place. He didn't know where he was. There were people coming in with gunshot wounds, and there was all the commotion that normally occurs in an ER. And he didn't know why we were there. And I had to keep saying, Dad, it's okay, we're here. Why are we at a hospital? Well, because you swallowed a hearing aid. I did what? I want to go home. I said, I know, Dad, but we can't. And I go back up to the desk. Please, my dad needs to be seen. We'll get to him. Don't worry. By the time they got him into the ER, into an examining room, and determined that, yeah, they probably should do an x-ray, it was midnight.
Oh, wow.
They wanted to take his clothes off and put him into a hospital gown for the x-ray. He fought. That it literally took 3 doctors and a sheriff's deputy to hold him down enough to try to get his shirt off, and they finally gave up on that. I was telling him to smile for all, well, I hadn't gotten to that point yet. I hadn't learned about hypnosis, so. Anyway, we finally get him into the x-ray. I went in with him. And they took the x-ray and they said, did we unbutton his shirt? But they thought they were seeing a button. It was actually the hearing aid lodged in his throat. That's when they called in the thoracic team and did an emergency removal at 5 o'clock in the morning of his hearing aid, which they got out intact, washed off, and gave back to us.
Oh my gosh.
They said it's as good as new. You can, Well, that was a very frustrating experience for us. And not least of which was the fact that I expected more from the hospital. More understanding, that this man at that time, Dad was in his early 80s, had Alzheimer's. He was hard of hearing, but that didn't mean he was stupid. And they kept yelling at him. When he didn't respond or seem to understand what they wanted to, they'd raise their voices louder, which my dad took to be a sign of anger. They were yelling at him. And he responded in kind. Of course, if somebody's yelling at you, you're not going to take that well. I wrote a letter to the hospital administrator and expressed my disappointment that the medical team was not better equipped to cope or deal with patients with Alzheimer's. And I hope that's changed. As I say, it's been 10 years since my dad passed away. I hope there's a better understanding on the part of hospital staff to deal with this. And of course, you all are dealing with nurses and doctors all the time, so you can help make this connection as well and help intervene for the parents and spouses. But it's a struggle. But if you love somebody and you want to help, you're going to come up with things that can make their life easier. And I was just pleased and proud that I was able to do that for my dad. And then later for my mother, who had the vascular dementia. She passed away 2 years ago. She was in hospice. My dad was in hospice as well toward the end. And it was wonderful. The care they got was excellent. We were delighted with everything that they were able to do. I wouldn't wish this experience on anybody, but I'm so grateful that there are people out there who are trained and able to help, because it's one of the worst things in the world, especially when you're elderly yourself, to have to help an elderly spouse who is in trouble and whom you vowed to take care of. That vow can come back to haunt you, because there are things you just have to do, but you do. And I have no idea. Oh, there. Okay, still have time. If anybody had any questions or comments or your own stories.
Kim, I did want to point out in your book, Kim's book is at the back, and I'm just so amazed. I know what an incredibly intelligent woman that you are and how amazing you are, and yet you gave us this gift of this book that reads so easily that it doesn't matter if you're a registered nurse, your daughter, when you're taking care of your dad, like what I went through, and to be able to read through here and the tips that you give, just like carry a card in your pocket that, indicates if you're injured, or even to be able to say, I have dementia, please forgive me, and be able to give it to someone, and their whole attitude changes when they see that, waiters and waitresses. I know I did that with my dad. But the tips that you gave throughout this book, I just truly, truly want to thank you, because they're simplistic and powerful all at the same time, and anyone can use this book and be able to truly gain insight and do well for their loved one because of what you went through. So thank you so much for sharing in your book.
I do have one other thing. Thank you, Dawn. I wanted to mention this. My dad, like many Alzheimer's patients, wandered. How sometimes they leave the house for whatever reason and they forget how to get home. Dad did that twice. And the first time it happened, thank God it was May. It was the end of May. So dark didn't come until sometime later. Where we lived was within a big subdivision carved out of 500 acres of woods. And we backed onto another 500 acres of woods. We had 19 acres of woods. So all my dad had to do was step off our lawn and he was in the trees. And all he had to do was walk 10 feet and he couldn't see the house. And he disappeared. We had no idea where he was. He didn't live there, so he couldn't figure out how to get back. We called the police. We searched, for about 45 minutes on our own, and we called the police. And Hanover Sheriff's deputies are the most wonderful people in the world. They came out immediately and started hunting. We called everybody we knew in the neighborhood and told them to be on the lookout for my dad. We posted pictures of Dad all over the neighborhood and at nearby intersections. And we were out past the Ashlandberry farm, so it's fields and forests, and there are not a lot of houses. And my dad, thankfully, remembered some of his Eagle Scout training when he was a Boy Scout, and found his way to the little river, which ran behind our house, and knew that if you followed a river long enough, it would come to a road and civilization. So he followed the river and wound up coming out in the backyard of one of our neighbors. literally just through the woods, maybe 300 or 400 feet behind our house. And after we got Dad back, and we got him back before dark, but it was about 4 hours of hunting for him. The longest 4 hours in my life, really. My mother was beside herself in a panic. We learned about the tracking device that Hanover County provides for free to anybody who needs it. It could be a child with autism. It could be someone with dementia. It could be anybody who is apt to wander and may not know how to get home. And this is a radio-controlled device, so it emits a frequency. And Hanover County will come out every month to make sure that the device is right. It can go on your wrist or it can go on the ankle. You can't get it off. The ordinary person, the wearer, cannot unclick it or unlatch it. It's on there until the deputy takes it off. And they come out and check and update it and add batteries or change whatever. They have a track record of finding anybody who is lost wearing one of those devices within 30 minutes. It's phenomenal. Some years ago, when I worked for the Red Cross, we got a call one day that a little boy with autism had gone missing in the woods by the north end of Battlefield. And I don't know if you remember this case. This was about 2014, I'm thinking, that it happened. And I was in charge of the volunteer program at the Red Cross at that point and was a disaster responder. And so I got a call from the sheriff's deputy saying, we're setting up a search team. Will the Red Cross open a food tent and help us out? And do you have volunteers who can pitch in? We said, of course. And what had happened was the family had been walking down the trail at the north end of Battlefield. And the parents turned to look at a monument, and their autistic son went that way. And within seconds, it was like my dad. He stepped into the woods. They couldn't see him. They tried hunting for a long time. They called the sheriff. The sheriff rounded up all the deputies, and they called us. For 7 days, we hunted for that little boy. This was November. 7 days in November hunting for him. And the north end of Battlefield is almost directly behind my house. There's a creek that separates the battlefield from our property. So every day, my husband and I were down in our woods looking. And one of the things that they'll tell you, you probably know this about children with autism, is that they don't often come when they're called. And if they don't know who's calling them, if they see strangers, they're going to hide. And they're not going to hide in a logical place. They're going to crawl into that briar patch. So you can't just walk past something and say, oh, well, nobody would be hiding in there. That's full of prickers or whatever. They could well be in that place, but they're not going to respond to you calling them. You're going to have to go in after them. So 7 days looking for this child. And every night, when everybody went home, they would have left food packages at various spots in the area, hoping that he would come out of his hiding place once he felt it was safe and find a package and eat something and get some liquid and pray that it wouldn't rain. And the temperature did not go below 50 for those 7 days. And it didn't rain. And it wasn't bad weather. And on the 7th day, a storm was coming in that afternoon. And everybody knew it was going to be a horrible storm. And we were all told, if we can't find him today, then the odds are not good that he'll survive. Because the temperature is going to drop to below freezing and we're going to have this hard rain. He was spotted lying curled up in a dry ditch at about 1:45 that afternoon. He was fine. He was alive. He was healthy. He'd been finding those food packages. They spotted that every day. They could see that he had found something and had eaten it. And about 45 minutes after that, the heavens opened and the temperatures plummeted and the rain came in and he was found. It was an amazing thing. His parents now have him wearing that device. My dad, when he went back home up to Michigan, because he and my mom wanted to go back there. They had to leave the device here because they couldn't have taken it back up to Michigan. It's only for people who live in Hanover. But when he came back, we were just about to go get it, and Dad wandered off again, and he was found sitting in a neighbor's car. My dad worked for an advertising agency for years that advertised for Oldsmobile, so he was a car lover. And he spotted this car and went in and sat down in the passenger seat and waited to be driven somewhere. And they found him again. But that is such a life-saving device. And if you are working with any family that has someone who has an autistic child or a spouse or someone with dementia, I strongly urge you to sign up for that program. It's totally free. It's not free everywhere, but it is in Hanover. Yes, ma'am.
My mother-in-law had Alzheimer's, and this was before they had the device. We had heard about them working on the invention. We had been told to put a shoebox on the door handle so they could not escape. She could not escape. They can't find the door handle. They can't get out of the house, and that's what we did because she had gotten out a couple times, but we found her before they had found her before she had left the yard, and so we used the shoebox on the door handle, and she never
Good
got out
idea.
the door.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Having an alarm system where the door chimes
We
every
did that
time
too.
it's open, that's what we did as well, and that really made a big difference. But if you are, all outside and somebody turns their back, and it's not hard to walk away. So it's tough caring for someone, especially when you know the outcome is never going to be good. But if you love somebody, you do what you can.
My grandmother, this was back in 1980, late 1980s. She had, over time, she had a trouble with warfarin, and every time they took her off of it, she had a stroke. She ended up having 7 strokes. And after one of the last couple of strokes, she had gotten to a childlike state. And they said, well, we'll put her in a rehabilitation center to try and help her. Well, they put alarms on the bed. They did everything. She kept escaping, they said. They called us up at home. They said, your mother has gotten out of bed and we can't find her. And we went there and we started looking for her with the nurses and stuff. They found her in another patient's room, hiding in a closet. When we opened the door, she just looked at us and laughed and thought it was funny. So they said, I think she'll be happier if you take her home. And we packed her stuff, put her in the car, we brought her home, and the first thing she did, she walked into the door, she sat in her favorite chair, and she sighed, because she was happy. Sometimes, even though they've gotten to that childlike state or whatever, sometimes when they get around something familiar or they know, it can automatically calm them. And that's just something I thought was interesting.
Absolutely. It's a good thing to do.